Right, I'm going to introduce our three expert witnesses, or actually I can let you introduce yourselves actually, much easier than me trying to pronounce your surnames.
I'm David Rudlin, I'm Director of Urban in Manchester, and I'm going to be talking about growth and the green agenda with regard to things like garden cities.
I'm Eddie Murphy from Mott MacDonald. I'm a Technical Director in our Sheffield office. I'm an engineer, mechanical engineer by profession. I design pipes and wires and ducts in buildings. But from there I seem to have got a veered off the path somewhere, so you'll see that very much from the presentation.
And good evening, I'm Gary Topp. I'm currently doing a extended piece of freelance work actually for the Bristol Green Capital Partnership. I'm going to talk to you about Bristol, of course. I've had the pleasure of working across cities in the north of England, in Yorkshire for a decade or so it's great to be back in Sheffield, and then in Melbourne, Australia for 4 years, and the last couple of years in Bristol, so look forward to talking to you.
Okay, you can all hear me now. Okay. Like I said, I'm Eddie Murphy from Mott MacDonald. I'm a consultant engineer by profession. Been an engineer for the best part of 20 years. And this has been quite a cathartic exercise for me, because what you're going to get is probably the last 13 years, about 20 years that I've spent in practice, condensed into around about 15 minutes. Whoever asked me to speak on these particular topics, you see at each of the four corners, seems to have been following me for the last 13 years, because they obviously know that I've been doing things in these particular areas, and I guess I've got enough out there as far as Twitter and the internet and that kind of stuff for you to probably Google and find some of this stuff anyway. So I'm going to start at the top left, which is on low carbon design and construction, and very quickly take you into what it is that we do when we're actually looking at design, and we sort of approach with the client. So we have an ethos. And the ethos is quite simply, we do good design for good clients, then produce good projects, and hopefully from when we produce those good projects, we tell a good story, and that will help, hopefully then, give us more good clients. And this is not by accident. This comes from a guy called Ove Arab, where I used to work at one particular time, and I thought it was a good mantra to have, and so I've held on to it. And Ove himself would have been a guy who was certainly passionate about having good people to work for him, also involving comprehensive analysis in all the projects that actually go through the office. And it's the same now for me and my team at Mott MacDonald. Every project we do, we take comprehensive analysis to it. And then, to boot, in order to make us better, to be better at what we do, we always involve some element of research. And I guess it's that research that you'll see as a common thread that actually goes through most of what I'm going to talk about. And going back to where it all started, with the Home Office in Vulcan House, and this is Nunnery Street, down by the River Don at Riverside, Mill Sands, just behind the court buildings. You'll see these two buildings. All part of one building that's actually been joined together by a bridge in the middle. It became the largest office to be built in Sheffield since Norfolk, over 18,000 square metres, housing nearly 2,000 people. And the remit that I actually got from the Home Office was, we want you to be our sustainability consultant. And I've never been asked to be a sustainability consultant up to that point. I'd always been asked to be a building services engineer who looked after the energy of buildings, but never the sustainability consultant. So we needed to get this building to BREEAM Excellence, and we did. It was low energy, we did that. They didn't have the money at that particular time because it's a speculative development. So it was actually built by a developer speculatively to rent to the Home Office. So no renewables could be included. As a matter of fact, the building's actually air conditioned. But despite the fact of being air conditioned, it became one of the lowest energy buildings of its kind in the country, and certainly the lowest energy of its kind on government estate. So much so that the government actually decided that they want to write a case study history of it. And so you'll still find, even to this day, this document, 16 pages of what we actually did to Vulcan House as a means to actually get it to be certainly one of the most sustainable buildings in Sheffield, I would say. It was the first to measure its footprint of construction process right from start to finish. It's the first with 100% FSC timber. It's got 0 VOC content. All the insulation, every single scrap of material that went into it, we made sure it had 0 VOC. 0 ODP. All the refrigerants in the building are not common refrigerants that you see, day in, day out. We use natural refrigerants. We use ammonia as the key refrigerant to make the building almost 0 ODP. 98% recycled content. And then the research came in. We actually got a PhD student from Sheffield, from the Arts Tower here, to actually look at BREEAM and its effectiveness. And did BREEAM actually do what it was supposed to do on it? So all of that led to the next building. So I think word got out what we've done. We shouted about it. We won 6 awards for Vulcan House, and then lo and behold, the Department of Education came and gave us 2 St Paul's Place to do a Cat B refit. Again, speculatively developed by CTP in the centre of town, just off the Peace Gardens there. This particular one, we were able to put a large solar array onto it. But again, analysis, we modelled the energy of the building inside the brain of the computer, came out with a target of 169 kilowatt hours, so 20 kilowatt hours or so less than Vulcan House. And in the end, through staying with the building for 2 years afterwards, we bettered that target by a further 30%. So now this building is actually the lowest energy, fully air-conditioned building on the government estate, with a deck band D at 89. If anybody finds a band D for an air-conditioned building lower than that anywhere in the country, please let me know, because I don't think it exists. So, odd things that we did in 2 St Paul's Place, they were actually ripping out some bits of timber from the reception area. We actually recycled that and made it into the furniture that actually is in the current reception. So you can walk into the reception now and see our recycled reception desk and recycled furniture made from timber that was pulled out of the original fit-out. And then the research kicked in again. We actually went back to Innovate UK, asking for £53,000 in order to be able to look after this building, to make sure that its energy was as good as we wanted it to be, that it hit the target. But as part of the deal, Innovate UK said, listen, you need to undertake a survey of the people to understand how they're actually using the building and whether they like it or not. So again, we actually did the survey for them. It was 100% return, 700 people returning 700 questionnaires. Those of you who've got kids in schools in Sheffield, there are 27 secondary schools, as I understand it, in Sheffield. We at Mott MacDonald have undertaken the full design of 13 of them. 11 of them under the BSF programme, and a further 2. There were 14 schools in the BSF programme. The first 3 were done by a different consultant, and we took over from that consultant and did the rest. But the 2 I'm probably most proud of are actually the 2 PFIs. One at Meadowhead School, and the other one's Westfield School. A lot of design analysis went in to make those 2 schools work, because the previous 2 PFIs were found to be not working quite so well. So it was BSF that actually sparked our attention to the links between education and the sustainable economy, because we were asked by the planners here to actually do green roofs and renewables, and we said, well, hang on, we haven't got money for green roofs and renewables, but what we'd like to do is actually go into the schools and teach the teachers to teach the kids how to be green, and maybe we'll save more carbon doing that than actually putting renewables on that could actually not be there after 10 or 15 years. So we ended up doing that. So they said, yeah, go ahead. So the planners let us go ahead. And we ended up producing what we called our Pocket Planet Plan. And the Pocket Planet Plan was actually introduced. We had one for every single school, which ended up being a report that was produced by Mott MacDonald. And I wanted to actually turn it into something like this. but I actually couldn't get it done. These are just mock-ups of it, and I really wished actually that we could have got as far as this. But in any event, the plan actually failed because we couldn't actually get teachers to teach sustainability. They weren't actually educated themselves enough about sustainability and sustainable practice. The kids quickly overran them, so it became the kids teaching the teachers, and that's when they lost control. Just to give you a text, so going back onto the occupants' own business reaction to green buildings. I hope I'm doing okay for time here, because I feel I'm taking a long time. On Vulcan House, we got Ida Monofred from here to actually do the study for us. These are kind of some of the things that she actually found, quite peculiar to us at the time. 70% of the people in Vulcan House actually thought that sustainability was a driver to reduce comfort in the building. That actually comfort was actually second place to sustainability. That we let the temperature go too high, we let it go too low, and that caused issues with comfort. 59% of the people actually thought the building was sustainable. They actually did think it was a sustainable building. But despite all of that, we had almost a third of people actually using a desk fan or a heater to actually maintain their comfort in the building itself. So clearly, the fact that it was a sustainable building was not impacting the behaviour of the people who were actually in it. When we looked at satisfaction, staff satisfaction, it was about 69% of people who actually thought that the building was a good building as far as they were concerned. But we had, and Ida's study concluded at the end, that green design of itself does not guarantee a good or favourable occupant outcome. So you can see that we're actually starting now to think, well, hang on a minute, maybe what people think about buildings is important. And as designers, we're trying to take that on board. Which is why when we went into 2 St Paul's Place, the opportunity to look at the staff again and to assess what the staff thought again was a good thing for us to do. So we did look at energy use, and we did make energy interventions, and we got the energy down by 30% in what was already a really good building. But the most interesting part was when we did what we call a building user survey, a BUS survey, which is now done commonly as part of what's called soft landings. And governments are mandating soft landings on all new buildings from 2016 onwards. So we were kind of road testing this soft landings approach. So where you see an orange dot, that means we're in average mode. So for comfort, the users actually thought we're okay, we're good, but we're not great. Design, they actually thought the design of the building was great. It's in a great location, it's great interior. In satisfying their own needs, they thought, well, it's okay, it's average. And this line down here, this line here, this dot represents our building in relation to 300 other buildings that have actually gone through exactly the same process, answering exactly the same questionnaires in exactly the same way that the analysis is actually carried out. And you can see that 68 percentile is not. For us anyway, we were thinking, well, this is such a fantastic building, won loads of awards, really green, really low energy, beating all targets, left, right and centre. Why don't these people think it's fantastic? And that led me to think, well, how would we actually set out to design a building that was fantastic as far as the people in it were concerned before we actually put pen to paper? Business value of sustainable buildings. What it's actually got to do is drive improved productivity, improved well-being, and contentment with facilities. So these are the things that actually add business value. So the project that we're actually doing to find out what drives satisfaction in buildings is called Project Arete. It's a 2-year KTP that we're doing now with UCL and Space Syntax to develop a tool to better understand what people will think of a building before we actually go ahead. And we'll be using lots of quite clever techniques, including crowdsourcing and that kind of thing, to the internet and social media, to try and generate the data that we actually need to drive the tool. So then we move on to the case for environmental investment in green. I've actually had some look at this. So we certainly had a look at it doing whether or not Vulcan House was itself a good case, a case study that actually itself, that we spent about another 1.5% additional over what we might have spent with money, particularly on the chillers, the green chillers and that kind of stuff. And the studies at that particular time led us to, this is pre-crash. So pre-crash, financials case for sustainability just wasn't there as far as we were concerned, and all the studies that we sort of looked at. There were studies in the United States that actually probably said, well, okay, there is a case for green buildings, but we knew that they were actually looking at very new buildings and comparing them to very old buildings, and you're going to get a discrepancy when you start to compare very new buildings with very old ones. So a study here in the UK by Tim Dixon at University of Reading that actually suggested that whilst there was a tentative case for it, there was no real suggestion that there was anything very solid that was about the case. So but now, as part of this that we're doing with on Project Arete, we've come across GRESB, which is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which is an initiative that's actually being developed by people who are looking after property portfolios. So the people in the city who are compiling, for the insurance companies and pension companies, who are compiling property portfolios, they're very concerned now. Post-crash, they're not left with they're not left with property that is of itself toxic. So they really need to know that the property itself is actually of good quality before they actually start to invest in it. And that measure of quality all of a sudden now seems to be sustainability. Because we know when we design sustainable buildings that a lot more care and attention goes into their design. A lot more rigour goes into the checking and understanding of them and what they're going to do. So in GRESB, these are the topics that it actually assess, right from corporate management structure of the company that's operating the buildings or owns the buildings, right down to public health disclosure, its monitoring, its performance indicators in terms of energy, water, building certifications such as BREEAM, and then finally this thing of a personal touch, as it were, stakeholder engagement, both external and internal. And this, as I say, the portfolio, the interest in this is really quite compelling at this particular minute in time. So this leaves us down to cities, and I mean I've been involved in sort of advising in some capacity on the Sheffield City, but first through the Sheffield First Environment Partnership, and then more lately in the LEP, the SEO LEP, Low Carbon Sector Group. And again, my own feeling with regard to all this, sort of informed by some of the experience of my own design career, but also by the fact that I've kind of sat and listened to many presentations from people in the city. What I believe we kind of need to get to, and maybe there is the formulation of something like that, maybe that's what the Green Commission is trying to get to, is a really coherent and clear vision, formulated by good people, again with this comprehensive analysis, and informed by research. Strong leadership, a long-term plan. The kind of change that we're trying to initiate here is not something that's going to be done in one 4-year term of an election. It is something that really needs to be done over a longer term and looked at over a longer term, and agreed by all parties that it is something that can be, that is an objective that's worth looking at things over the longer term. And of course we need to learn from other cities, and I think a lot of other cities who are getting this right are looking at things over a longer term. I wrote an email to the Sheffield First Environment Partnership 10 years ago now, this email, and it was very, very soon after the Northern Way was published, which was a sort of part of the thing with, say, Yorkshire Forward and a couple of other entities. they kind of described Sheffield as a weakly monocentric economy that does little to impact the other wider spatial conurbations around. We have a workforce that is largely low-skilled, industry that is specialised in advanced manufacture, which of itself doesn't really require a lot of local feeder services to the lower end and lower skilled people. Traditionally heavily reliant on public sector employment, Sheffield is. Educationally, we were at that particular time right at the bottom, and I'm really pleased to see that we're starting to make our way back up through the league tables. We have poor quality housing, which again doesn't means that we don't attract the higher end of the skills market to come and stay in Sheffield. The other things that I'll leave you to read, given the time, I'll leave you to read those. But for me, one of the key things goes back to this thing about education and skills, and we really do need to get to grips with. I went to a presentation about 5 years ago in Manchester, where the chief executive, the assistant chief executive of Manchester said, the first thing we need to do if we want to grow our economy is get to grips with primary schools. If you lose a primary school kid after the year of 6 years of age, they either become a problem to society or they become the saviour of society, and it is as important as that. I think more needs to be done to connect our skills base to our organisations, companies and businesses who are here. We need to align what is taught in local schools with local skills demands. And I guess the other thing then is to retain as many of our university migrants as we possibly can by attracting the jobs that actually do attract them and keep them here. Spatial planning, David's going to talk about that, but I think spatial planning is actually critical to this as well. Economic planning and spatial planning need to be done in the same theatre. It's no good to do economic planning of itself, and it's no good to do spatial planning of itself. The two need to be joined at the hip and one reinforce the other. Sydney's a fantastic example of that. And then last but not least, in the final slide you'll be glad to hear, this thing about the social dimension. I came to Sheffield 30 years ago, and the first thing I noticed is the character and the charisma of its people. And again, Sheffield needs to retain that, and whatever we do, we need to retain. And low carbon living has to be something that we actually need to foster. And low carbon can mean places to play.
I came with two presentations tonight because there's a lot to talk about in Bristol at the moment, and I'm going to run through some first ones where there's no slides on the screen, so you can just look at that lovely one while I try and talk through something very quickly. If you're in Bristol at the moment, we're very, very busy and excited around this green city, or as I prefer to think of it, future sustainable cities space. And because you'll probably know this, we are European Green Capital this year. There's a bit of architectural, as in who runs what stuff going on in the city. So one of the slides that I could put up would have three organisations on it. One would of course be the City Council. You can never have a conversation about future cities without talking about government. The second organisation will be a time-limited company called the Bristol 2015 Company, which is wholly owned by the council and is effectively an events and marketing company for the year, the activities that are going on. So if I was one of my colleagues from that, I would be doing a quick slide deck that I'm going to actually just read from for you, because it'll be helpful just to contextualise this thing. It would say that the city won it because we've achieved high environmental standards, lots to debate in that, is committed to ambitious goals for sustainable development, can act as a role model to inspire other cities, and received a very high technical assessment to win the award. We talk a lot about the fact that the previous European green capitals have been Stockholm, Hamburg, Victoria, Gasteiz, Nantes and Copenhagen, and Bristol very proud of the fact that its name goes after Copenhagen for all sorts of reasons that will be obvious in this space. It talks about the fact that it won it because it's got many years of pioneering environmental efforts, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. You do have to do a 12-point technical assessment. Bristol did pretty well on it, with pretty poor air quality and transport. So there's lots of work to be done. It'll talk about the fact that we've got strong community partnerships. That's where I come in. It'll talk about the exciting plans it's got for the year, and just go on the website. There's lots going on, and it's got a real sense of ambition and fun for the future. Copenhagen talk about one thing, up from their year, the need to develop citywide partnerships. So City Council, 2015 time limited company, Bristol Green Capital Partnership. And that's the bit that I'm currently delighted to be involved with. And because of time, what I'll do is I'll flip over to this other presentation. That's me. So I'm doing an extended piece of consultancy for the Green Capital Partnership at the moment. Why am I doing that? Because the City Council back in 2007 realised they had what you might think of in economic development terms as a green cluster in the city. Lots of people that were interested in it. So the then leader of the council, Barbara Yancey, is now in the upper chamber, decided to pull together a group of people and said, we care about this stuff in this city, don't we? What might we do from a non-council perspective if we bring together a bunch of organisations that I like to think of as civil society? So civil society is an interesting term, but it's effectively all those agencies and organisations and community groups in the city that are not government. And there's something really fascinating about how cities will change in the future and the role of civil society in that, because we too often and too easily see this as a government-only agenda. It decided that it ought to have a name for what this group of people should be, and because there was much noise in the city at that point about the fact that it had just lost the culture capital title to Liverpool, I have to say that I also felt that because I was part of Bradford's bid to win that particular year. It thought, gosh, wouldn't it be good if the European Union came up with something called a green capital, and said, what will be is the Green Capital Partnership, and by some genuine fluke, a year later, the European Commission came up with something called the Green Capital. So somehow or other, the purpose of this partnership started to have a real focus. How do we go out and make Bristol the European Green Capital? I don't think I quite say it on this set of slides, but it tried 3 times and won it finally in 2013 to be this year's Green Capital. What was the partnership doing in the meantime? It was delivering stuff that probably is not too dissimilar to references to Sheffield First and all sorts of stuff that had gone on in the city. It started to think about peak oil. It started to think about how do we bring together people that care about this stuff? How do they work collectively and collaboratively, both with the council and outside of the council? What do other forms of governance mean in this sector? All the while focusing its energies as a partnership on winning the Green Capital, and indeed it did that. It was obviously a lead part of the bid, so the then chair, vice chair and main actors in the Green Partnership went to Brussels, did the presentation and won the award. You can see all of this stuff online, so I didn't really need to go through it, but it meant that we were suddenly going on a different journey. But until 2013, the partnership in Bristol was very definitely a council partnership. And this might factor into some of your thinking about work here. So the council effectively were silent sponsors of it. It pretended that the partnership was an independent collective in the city. It wasn't. It was part of the council. And in 2013, it recognised as we moved into this new phase that it was time to set the partnership free and ask some questions about what happens when a civil society organisation that does all sorts of good stuff in the city comes together as an alternative voice for what a city future might be. It's been an extraordinary journey really over 2014. So as the city was gearing up and creating its own company to deliver the marketing and events, wonderful stuff, the partnership that was very much part of its fabric decided to set itself up as a community interest company, and we've now got our governance right, a board of directors looking after that, and that's part of the first thing that I did. Working on what, as a partnership, it needed to do to work with the 2015 company and to work with the council. But what actually was happening underneath this was the organisations that started off as 12 people in a room, literally, it's now burgeoned, and if we were to go onto the website today, you'd see 830 organisations in the city. 830 civil society organisations in the city are saying we care about this stuff enough to pledge and be a member of this thing called the Bristol Green Capital Partnership. That's an enormously powerful story, actually. Yeah? And we don't know this for true, but we reckon it's the biggest civil society partnership that cares about this stuff that we can find anywhere in the world, and we've just taken it to the ICLEI conference in South Korea, and nobody could come up with anything better. And again, if you refer to Copenhagen, which all of us would see as some kind of beacon of green cityness, wouldn't we? Yep. They came out of their year having established a partnership which has got 90 members at the moment. So there is something extraordinary going on in Bristol about the fact that a lot of organisations care about it. When you talk about sustainable city futures, you start to realise that everybody comes at it from a specialism. What I like to think of, with all due reference to my university colleagues, as a rather academic approach. You know, you're either interested in space and urban design, or you might be interested in food, or you might be interested in energy, or you might be, and so everybody follows their silos, don't they? Yeah. And the thing that I think is really interesting, and that sticks with me more and more the deeper I go into this in my own career, is it's this polymath space. It's how you join all that stuff up to get a very complex set of actors changing a city for the future. Yeah? So I actually don't believe that it's education that will solve this. I don't believe it's a different energy approach. I think it's all of these things. Yeah? And somehow or other, our mechanisms of reviewing and thinking about city futures, I don't think understand this well enough yet. And so we might talk a little bit about social innovation or social enterprise. We might talk about some of the new models of financing and all those things. Collectively is the only way that we'll make this happen. Doing lots to support 2015. We get our members together for extraordinary, what we call quarterly partnership gatherings. Yeah, so about 200 of our 800 members will regularly come together to address a theme. A couple of weeks' time, we're doing food. Yeah, the food movement in Bristol is extraordinary. Yeah. Anything you can think about in terms of how a city improves its thinking around food, yeah, is happening in the city through a multitude of groups. But we are trying now to be a sustainable, independent civil society leadership organisation for the city, yeah? And, you know, that's a complex thing, other than if you think about it as an alternative chamber of commerce, yeah? So just think about it a little bit, yeah? What businesses have done at city level for a long time have come together and formed themselves into a chamber of commerce, yeah? Or, you know, you might think about trade associations, the RIBA, or you might think about trade unions. So this notion of collective action leading to extraordinary change, yeah, is something that we think needs to be better explored at city scale. So, if anybody saw Selma recently, did anybody see Selma? Yeah. You know, it seems like a very grandiose relationship to make, doesn't it? But, you know, 50 years ago, civil rights movement in America, you know, that notion of collective action, people saying change can happen, seems to me to be something of what cities are going to need to get better at doing in order to deliver the kind of change, and it's interesting, both of the previous speakers referred to this, is unavoidably what's got to happen. So it's a lovely book, The Cities of Good View. Many of you would have read it, I'm sure. But that notion of density, of the fact that actually cities are the solution to global climate change, yeah, is something that we're going to have to get a lot more comfortable with. I had the great pleasure of living and working in Melbourne for 4 years recently, and I was director of one of their local governments, and actually one of the most progressive bits of Melbourne, a city called Knox. We started to put through planning applications there that encouraged two-storey dwellings. Can you imagine 2 stories? Yeah. Remember that Australia is an American system. Basically, the bungalow is king, the quarter-acre block is king, and we had protests on the streets in Australia with people with placards saying that it would block out the sun. Yeah. Now, the only reason I tell that story is partly because it's a bit of fun. But this notion of what density is, about what we're comfortable with, is massively variable globally, yep? And density is going to be something that we're going to have to get our heads around a lot. So, you know, 450,000 people in Bristol at the moment, 550 here. We talk about functional area of about 1.1, 1.2 million. That'll pick up nicely all David's stats. Bristol does have an enormously, has the highest education achievement rates of any city in the country. Graduate retention is extraordinary. I don't know whether all that stuff translates into why it's got 830 organisations prepared to sign up to a sustainable city future. I don't know what that means because we've never done a cause and effect on it, but we kind of know it matters, don't we? And the fact that the other presentations have picked this up, and any city future debate picks it up, there is something latent, yeah? that we have to both amplify and bring together at city scale to make the really radical change that needs to happen. Yeah? I sometimes think we're all very polite and think that in some way sustainability is going to happen at some point and don't worry, we'll get there. Yeah? Whereas we might take more of an impassioned Naomi Klein view of the world, which says the systems we've got at the moment don't work, guys. Yeah? And we're going to have to change the pace on this stuff. And civil society might be a very powerful way of doing that. So how do cities encourage that to happen better? That little thing about Klein, one of the things that doesn't quite come through strong enough for me in her group is the fact that actually it's multiple actions by many people that can make things change. You can change the energy grid not through government policy, but through actually small-scale operations, and there's plenty of evidence for that. The Magnet Cities report's an interesting one. I just like this one. It's city government alone cannot reposition a city. Yeah? So too often we keep looking to government. Yeah? How do we make that partnership with government from a civil society perspective work in a more powerful way? Seems to me something to think about. So I think there's a refreshed intellectual foundation. We've got some great work going on with the two universities in Bristol. That notion that it's got to carry our whole community with it. Bristol, like every other city, is a two-tier city. We haven't cracked that. This notion to cross-cutting and collaborative work being a very powerful and very difficult tool to put into place. Yeah? Cross-cutting and collaborative. Yeah? I think it's the key to this stuff. We have to be a service-based organisation because nobody pays for anything, so we're looking at that. You don't need to worry about that. New business model for Green Capital Partnership. There is so much activity, 130 organisations. I always joke in Bristol, if you want to open a bakery, you can guarantee somebody's doing it, an artisan bakery. Maybe you need to open a wholemeal only bakery, or there'll be people doing that. Maybe you just need to do a spelt flour bakery, there's people doing that. Yeah, so gap analysis doesn't work in Bristol. Yeah, I'm trying to give you a sense of just how dense the thinking is in Bristol, but there's still so much at city scale to do to achieve actually what really needs to be achieved in global terms against that new city model. We know that we've got to develop a consortium approach, and that leadership impact is going to be really important. Was that somewhere near quick enough? Thank you.
Right, so we're going to have a question and answer session now. So format is I have a set of questions here, so I'm hoping everybody who's asked a question is here. So I'm going to read the name out. I think all apart from one has said they want the question to go to the whole panel, so we'll work on that basis. And then we'll have the rest of the panel members, they'll all get a chance to answer it, and then we'll move on to the next question. So there's 6 questions here, and then once we've got through those, if there's still some time before 8 o'clock, we'll open it up to the floor, as long as the people are reasonably sensible, but not too sensible, obviously. So first of all, Luke Wilson.
I'm from Manchester, and Manchester's have been fortunate enough to have had a city authority, combined authority, which is in charge of sustainability and which is now in charge of planning and is in charge of transport. It seems to me that this is the first prerequisite of doing anything sensible in this field. At the moment we have a ridiculous system where we abolished all regional planning. We're not even allowed to talk about regional planning, and we have places which are trying to grow which have no means of doing so. They're told they have to cooperate with their neighbours, probably different political parties, and they don't get on, and the whole thing makes no sense whatsoever. And so it seems to me that Sheffield needs to move towards having a combined authority at the city region as soon as possible. And if it doesn't do so, it will get left behind. And if it doesn't do so, it won't be able to deal with the issues that we've been talking about. The other great thing that Manchester's had, of course, is political stability, which is something we can't legislate for in quite the same way. But certainly George Ferguson in Bristol, through the elected mayor route, was intended to be someone who gave someone a decent term in office, a decent set of powers, and knowing George as a friend, I think if George can't do it, no one can. And one wonders, I talked to George, and I know how difficult he's finding it, just to try and, as someone who's not a politician, to manage a city like that. But you think that, if we can't do this, we're really not going to achieve anything. And so we need to think about governance as part of this whole process.
A couple of comments on that. I had the pleasure of sitting on the regional assembly in Yorkshire for 7 years as a social, economic and environment partner, and I know that regional devolution agenda is now largely seen as a failed attempt at devolution, but in fact we're in great danger of just reinventing it with this next set of devolution roles. we live in one of the most centralised government countries in Europe, if not the developed world. The notion of how much power goes down through a combined authority route, and the Tories have only slightly shown their colours on that at the moment, but we're likely to see something of that happen. It is very interesting, but the devolution debate tends to get dominated by actually how you cascade down the political layers. Yeah. And I think the real opportunity around the devolution debate is actually how you diversify decision making and service delivery at city or city region level. And again, I think there needs to be much more innovation attached to the devolution debate than simply cascading it from one set of politicians to another. I should make it clear I'm a huge fan of the political process, yeah? But I just think there needs to be more innovation in the way that we think about cities. Yeah? And so too much of the devolution debate for me at the moment just sees it as a political cascade. Just to pick up in Bristol, obviously Bristol hasn't had stable political leadership over the last 20-odd years. The fact that it did vote for an elected mayor, and the fact that in George we've got a very lively, empowered mayor, somebody that is deeply intelligent around the city futures debate, has unquestionably meant that the city has had a very sophisticated and constant level of discourse around this issue. There is everything to celebrate about that, but you'll also know, David, as I do from George, that he'd like to be able to have more influence. Yeah. And the truth is, even an elected mayor doesn't have that many powers at the moment. So there's a long way to go on this, I think.
I think devolution is about economic growth, ultimately, and economic growth traditionally has meant driving the economy. Sustainability and sustainable growth, one would think they would try to be the same thing, but I fear that the people in command, as it were, our politicians and our leaders, are probably not advanced enough in their thinking to really make the connection between sustainable growth and economic growth being actually the only kind of growth that is actually going to be sustainable in the long term. So from that perspective, I think this is about changing the thinking. It does actually come back to that question of education again. And it kind of, and when I talked about teachers in classrooms being overcome by the younger generations, because the younger generations actually got a better sense of what sustainable working and sustainable community and sustainable business, actually is, than actually those of us who are, the older ones, the grey hairs. We've not come through this problem in quite the same way that they're actually, coming up through it. Younger people, I guess, are looking more, they're more futurist than older people have generally been. And unfortunately, it is the policymakers and the older generation who've actually come through the 60s, the 70s, who are the ones who are actually looking at these kind of things now and driving this sort of agenda. And unfortunately, the thinking is still old thinking. So it really does needs education. And that education will come through eventually. I'm an optimist as far as that's concerned. And I can see the shoots of that actually starting now. But I do think this is a difficult question to answer, and probably one that's not going to be answered for a little while. Yeah.
That's a complex question. Okay, so the UK government's got to the government's got to worry about balancing the national books, if you like, and that's been very prevalent, hasn't it? But the question underneath this for all of us right now is this notion of whether growth is good, isn't it? Yeah. So actually, and then if you put it into a Sheffield Green Commission or a UK cities context, the question becomes, well, what can you do at city level? Yeah. to meet the needs of the community, rebalance the city's economies and make its contribution to national economies, you know, it's a complex question, isn't it? I again go back to this basis, we clearly need to start thinking and doing differently. So how can we change the expectation of what the public sector delivers, yeah, and build a different kind of response at city scale, yeah, to how we make our neighbourhoods better places to live, how we make our transport choices, how we make our food choices and those kind of things. And that's a real city innovation challenge for me, more than a city economy challenge. Yeah. And there's going to have to be some rethinking about our own personal economic expectations in that space as well, aren't there? It's a great and complex question. The issue is what you can do at city scale about it.
Yeah, I think I kind of got my head around it a little bit more now. I think what you're talking about is, you know, we are in what is quite short term, or what we think is a short term problem, the one of austerity and how do we get ourselves and how do we balance the books and all of that kind of thing. My own view is that the Green Commission is going to look, you know, a little bit beyond that. It goes back to this thing of, you know, the fix that we've got to put in place is not a 5-year fix or a 10-year fix. It's a 15, 20, 30-year fix, you know, that we need. And we do need to actually start to think, you know, on longer term cycles, because, you know, the investment cycles that are required to do this fixing, the education cycles that I just talked about to do this fixing, are all longer term. So I guess the answer to this question is we need to look at everything, how it all connects, and look at it over a longer term than we kind of look at it now. And I guess the political cycle has got to get used to looking at things over a longer term rather than just shorter terms. So I think that's...
The first thing, I would disagree fundamentally that you need to cut public spending to grow the economy. I think that is a Tory policy which I would not agree with. I think what we have in this country is an unbalanced economy. I mean, we can have a debate about growth. I actually think my friends in the Steady State Manchester group are probably wrong. I think we probably do need to grow, because if it is just so inherent to our system, we need to decarbonise growth. That's a different debate altogether. We need to decarbonise the growth that we have. But I think if we try and stop growth, particularly as a city, you just will get overtaken by everyone else who doesn't do it. You've got to actually think about the carbon impacts of your growth as opposed to just saying we'll deal with carbon by not growing. In Britain, we have an economy which is massively based on London. There was incredible figures. Like, was it for every 10 jobs created, something like 8 are in London? Just an extraordinary unbalance in our economy. So those figures I talked about in housing terms are mirrored in economic terms. And what we need to think about is how we actually grow the northern cities. And the zipped graph of cities probably has something to do with this, that we need our Barcelona or our Milan or something like that to actually balance and offset the power of the London economy. How do you do that? Now, there's a fantastic my hero, Jane Jacobs, wrote a book called The Economy of Cities. There's a chapter in that said, it's called Birmingham Good, Manchester Bad. And what she says basically is Birmingham is a city of 1,000 trades, which is very good at innovation, and therefore the car industry is in Birmingham. Manchester is a city of massive mills, no innovation, large workforces, and therefore it's dying as an economy. Now, while she was writing that, lots of people in squats in Manchester were making music and doing various other things. And so now you've got a situation where Birmingham, the car industry, has died and Manchester is booming. Actually, the lesson is that it's not about industry. You can't guess what your industry is going to be in 40 years' time. Advanced manufacturing, yes, maybe, but you don't know that. What you need is bright people. You need to grow them through your school system. You need to track them through the way the city works. You need as many bright people as possible, and in the future, cities which have people who can innovate will be successful. It's as simple as that. And that as a city, what you need to do is find a way to attract those people.
You know where I'm coming from on this, don't you? I mean, the answer is you absolutely need to play a huge role in it. That's a civil society thing. That's people taking an issue that they care about, coming together, exploring it, and then putting things into action. It's not, in some ways, we've got a long tradition of this in cities, yeah? But actually I think there's never been a better moment for us to see more of that kind of civil society activity going on. It's interesting, the two universities in Bristol in this year, the University of Bristol will talk about 100,000 hours of student volunteering as part of the Bristol effort this year, 100,000 hours. Yeah? That's an extraordinary contribution to the life of the city. Yeah? And the fact that it's voluntary touches a little bit on the economy question that we just answered as well. That notion of that's behind it around social or natural justice, yeah, drives a lot of that thinking. I find myself a lot in these conversations with people talking about what the young people have got to do. And I don't know whether or not it's because I'm not so young anymore, but I tell you, I haven't got any less energy now than I had when I was 15 or 20 around it. So I actually tend to think that we need to stop deferring the responsibility for the change that needs to happen back to the young generation and actually step up to the responsibilities that we all have now to make this happen. So as part of my absolute support for you bringing together the Sheffield Nature Network, and I'm sure you work very closely with Liz in the front row here and all of that kind of stuff, and that's, to me, extraordinarily exciting and hopeful. Let's not make this a debate about the next generation. Let's make it our challenge now to make cities better and own that cross-generationally. It seems to me that doesn't get said enough. No?
Well, I think you know what I'm going to say, because I've kind of said it already. I think the incumbent generation that we've actually got are, they're aware of the issues, but they don't quite get it, quite yet. I think younger generations are incredibly more connected, incredibly more informed, incredibly more active, with a little a, in terms of being prepared to have a voice and to be heard, on these particular agendas. And so I would say just keep doing what you do and assemble yourselves, bring yourselves together, and make your voice and voices heard as incredibly loudly as you possibly can. I think ultimately, this will transition to those generations who are coming up now, who will, and I seeing young people and dealing with young people as much as I do, I've got confidence that this will actually be solved. We will solve this more inherently within the next 10 years. That we will actually get the switch will be switched at that particular time, and sustainability, carbon agenda, the low carbon agenda will become infinitely more higher up the economic and political agenda than it is. We can see it's actually starting to happen now. There is a sort of a revolve starting to turn, but I do think younger people will are already so strong. Anyway.
I don't want to descend into platitudes. I come from a generation who grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, and I thought that when my generation got to my age, we would have changed the world. Most of my generation didn't stick to those they weren't necessarily environmental, but the whole sort of rock against racism thing, that whole sort of, all those problems were going to be solved by now, and they weren't, because basically when you grow up, generations change, and unfortunately the people with the power are not the ones with the passion. And the people who want to change the world maybe don't have the experience and the knowledge or whatever, but nevertheless they also don't have the power. And so my advice is, first of all, do stuff. Get involved in. When I was at that age, I set up a housing cooperative. I think doing practical things is useful, even if they're small, because if everyone does practical things, it's important. The second is hold us to account. When we're doing projects and we have people, campaigning and so on, it's actually really useful for us, because actually then people start to listen to the green agenda in terms of the projects we're involved in. So I don't want platitudes about we should just give power to young people and they'll change the world, because actually it isn't going to happen. We need to keep the faith, do practical stuff, and hold us to account.
there's lots of technical information about the poo bus, right? But basically, what it is a very clever engineer and innovator associated with the University of the West of England has come up with some technology that converts human waste into fuel. Yeah? And it's exactly what you expect. And in order to demonstrate that technology, one of the bus companies has indeed put on a bus that runs around the city every single day, being powered by human waste. Yeah? So it's one of those environmental technology challenges being beautifully played out in the city at the moment. Is it real? It's absolutely real. There's an awful lot of further environmental technology work to do on it. That's not really the issue, is it? We all know the technology's out there. The issue actually is how you put it into practice, yeah? And how you make it the norm, not the exception. It's particularly powerful in Bristol. I'm just trying to kind of put a bit of context around that because Bristol has very poor air quality, and that's largely due to the amount of diesel trucks that still go through the city centre. It's the most congested city at certain times of the day in the country, at least it claims to be, not with any great pleasure, of course. And transport and the transport infrastructure is a real pinch point in every way. At community level, at political level, in the city, things need to change. And the poo bus is simply one of the innovations that is out there at the moment, and it's a Bristol-based innovation. Is it a reality? We know this stuff is a reality. We know that decarbonising globally is a reality. Yeah? If only we have the political and economic will to make that happen. So it's simply a little example of that, isn't it? And I'm sure it's transferable.
Can I paraphrase that for you two? In what do you see as the role of disruptive technologies in cities achieving the goals we've been talking about?
As part of my remit on the Sheffield First Environment Partnership, I do remember having a presentation by transportation chappie from Sheffield City Council at one point, and he relayed the fact that your average bus on a Sheffield street costs first bus or whoever is running it £100,000 to actually buy in the first instance. That's an investment given the current rate of use of transportation in Sheffield that has only recovered after 20 years. So it takes them 20 years to get their money back. And then after that, they'll probably float the bus on and it'll be run by somebody else. So on average, the diesel engine technology that's running around inside buses in Sheffield is somewhere between 10 and 15 years. And in the same period, your average car is being held for around about 7 or 8 years. And so car engine technology is beginning to rapidly overtake bus engine technology. So we're actually getting to the point, I think at this particular time, we're going back about 4 years, he kind of reckons that by 2016, 2017, it would actually be cleaner to be driving a car than it would be to be driving a current bus with its old technology. So I think on that basis, we are back to this long-term thinking again, and trying to find ways in which we can actually start to think about buses and transportation and making them faster and cleaner, and getting to a point where the investment that actually needs to go into them is taken over longer term and in a more in a way that actually helps with the mix of what else is happening by way of car technology. And of course the other thing not to forget is that we design our cities to make them walkable, cyclable, so that those mix of technologies, human technologies if you like, are in the mix as well in order to reduce this air problem that we've got.
I don't know what disruptive technology is. I know that in terms of, I have arguments with people in Manchester about the fact that we shouldn't rely on technology to get us out of the hole that we're in, but we do sort of need it in the mix, and so I'm very happy about stuff as long as it's scalable. And the issue about the poo bus, is it scalable? Is it actually going to be something which has a widespread application, or is it something which is an interesting experiment but not particularly scalable? Public transport is crucial. And public transport is linked to the density of our cities. We only have buses because they are a distributed transport mechanism. Cars obviously even more so, but trams obviously are much less polluting, much more environmentally sound, and actually have a much better ridership in terms of who uses trams and so on. And Sheffield, the Green Commission, has a massive advantage. You have a tram system. Most cities don't have tram systems. Most cities didn't get through the Alistair Darling, guillotine when they brought them down on tram systems. Now you've got a tram system, extending it is much easier than building one from scratch. Ask Leeds about what they'd like to do with a tram system. You've got a tram system, build on that. Tram systems are transformative technology, even though they're incredibly old technology, because they do take people off the roads. They are clean technology. They do increase journey times in cities, and they're therefore very important. So go with the tram is an important thing to say, I think. The problem, as we've written about extensively with the UK housing market, is partly regulation, and actually, German homes are much more efficient and much bigger, and they spend about twice amount per square foot on the home than we do. So we already build very poor quality, very small housing, and I've had arguments with house builders to tell me that's not the case, but it is. Housing association, social housing is slightly different, but even that at the moment is being provided by private builders, and that's also very poor. The reason we do that is because we have a planning system which doesn't work. We have a planning system where half the cost of some housing goes into the value of the land, and so we're talking about allocating a piece of land for housing. We make a fortune for whoever owns that piece of land. Once that money's been paid to the owner, the amount of money left to spend on the housing is little. The amount that's left to spend on the infrastructure and the tram systems and all the open space and so on, even less. And so we end up spending incredible small amounts on housing, and yet we also have incredibly expensive housing. We have the worst of both worlds in this country, and we need to reform the system. And actually all three political parties sort of realised that before the election. There's a lot of discussion going on, and we've got the one that probably least likely to do anything about it, but even the Conservatives, George Osborne, has actually understood this as a problem. And actually I suspect there will be movement in the next 5 years to look at things like land value capture, to look at ways of actually dealing with that situation, because it's so dysfunctional that even Conservatives can't ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with what David just said. The technology to build zero carbon homes exists, and it's existed for a long time. We're talking about even 10 years, 15 years. That technology's. But I guess it's house builders. In some ways, I think house builders have actually been throwing their hands up in the air and saying this is too difficult and we can't make profit at this kind of thing, and that's kind of disrupted things negatively. If you want to sort of look at it. But the other thing, I mean, the construction industry per se is very conservative. With a small c. It is anathema to innovation. Innovation, it actually sees as huge risk, and it really doesn't want to go there when it comes to it. But we're dealing with stuff now. We're looking at people, the Living Building Institute in the States, who are looking at buildings that are restorative to the planet, not just low carbon. They've got no energy connection, they've got no water connection, they've got no drainage connection, they're beautiful, they're made of natural materials, they blacklist deleterious materials. So, and this is technology that's there. There are buildings that have been built like that, and so I think legislation has actually got to go further. I think it has got to push the envelope a little bit further, and it's got to force the construction industry to push the bar higher so that it will actually innovate to get to that particular bar.
I really have a lot to add, except I read recently that thing that human beings are the only creatures on earth that have to pay for where they live, which seems to me to be kind of curious somehow. Bristol's a highly affluent city in relative terms. That's always an interesting thing. Live in Australia, you see what post-European affluence really is. I live in the south of the city, which for a long time didn't gentrify. They just built a small development, a passive house around the corner. They put it on the market, it's sold out in hours. I don't know what that says about market demand, but there's something there, isn't there? So one of the things that the European Commission requires of the host city to do, and there are actually very few requirements, you'd be surprised, is that it actually produces a little bit of a handbook, a guide, to how each particular city has delivered its year, in order that future years, Ljubljana next year for instance, can say, well gosh, what do they do in Bristol? Let's have a look at that. So the Bristol method is a handbook that's slowly being put together, talking about how Bristol has addressed this issue. Yeah? A couple of things that are interesting about it. The ambition of the city to make this a year of transformational change has been a really challenging thing for city leaders, actually, because you cannot change a city in a year. Yeah? And so there's been much demand that the Bristol method might in fact be a blueprint for how every city, and it's interesting in this discussion, might suddenly in a year transform itself from where it is to where it's got to be. Changing cities is a deep and challenging thing. So the Bristol method is actually something more prosaic than that. It says, how did you deliver the year and what things were in place that helped you to secure and deliver against the very modest requirements of the European Commission to own this award. The Green Capital Award, is quite a new thing. And if you look back at what other cities have done, it ain't the Olympics yet, this thing. Yeah? It's not the Football World Cup, although people will think about it like that. And many other cities have really made quite modest celebrations of the year. Bristol's done exponentially more in terms of public events and celebration than any previous European Green Capital. But of course, like any city, it says, is that all we're doing? And so it's quite an extraordinary dynamic in the city, which I think actually again references just how much energy there is for more of this stuff. Yeah? How do we mainstream it? How do we make it not one-off? How do we don't do one-off projects that celebrate but make these things systemic in the city? These are the questions that are coming up. You won't quite find the answers to that in the Bristol method. You will find, and it's up on our site already, quite a nice detailed history of the way that the partnership came to bear. It's interesting that if George Ferguson, our mayor, was on this platform, he would do this, and he does it every time. He'd say, it was the partnership that won the award for the city. It was the fact that so many community groups, so many organisations started to do stuff that really gave Bristol its ground up thing on this. I'm just sharing that as maybe you'll reflect on how that applies in Sheffield at the moment. I don't know the answer to that, but there's something very powerful about that I think we're really thinking deeply in the city about how we capitalise on that now going forward, and that's not easy, actually.
And would you have done anything different?
Would we have done anything different? It's too early to say on that. I think we might have managed expectations. Might be an interesting thing, because inevitably you put a very bright city that cares a lot about this stuff together, and it says we really need to make everything that's been a problem with the city sorted in this 1 year. Yeah? Right. And you can't do it, and we should have managed that expectation slightly differently.
Okay, I think if everybody's okay to stay for 10 minutes, I'd like to ask if there's any questions from the floor. If you'd just like to give your name first, and then ask your question.
Jenny Patient from Sheffield Climate Alliance. I think one of the biggest planning and sustainability challenges for Sheffield would be about the existing housing stock and how to make it sustainable, how to reduce the energy use. And I see a massive project needed to achieve that. Do any of the panel have any pointers for how we can bring that about in Sheffield? Thanks.
David? Thank you.
Well, we sort of had a solution to that. It was called the Green Deal. And in theory, it worked. Everyone laughs, but in theory, it worked really well. Basically, use the savings of your utility bills to fund the capital works required. You don't need to reinvent that wheel, you just need to make it work. In Urbed, we run a thing called the Carbon Cooperative, which is essentially doing the Green Deal without Green Deal money. I mean, we had Green Deal money for the first 10 that we did. But basically, it's a cooperative of households that come together to increase their buying power, to retrofit their homes based upon borrowed money on the basis of their future bills. And we have models which do that. We're creating a retrofit handbook, so the standard details that people can use in their home. And if you're a public sector landlord or a housing association, your responsibility is to do this for your tenants. And it just has to happen. I mean, as you say, it's fantastic having carbon-free new housing or whatever, but, as you say, the existing stock is where we need to focus. And we just need to have a system that works. It's one of those things, when it does work, it will just take off. And it will happen in sense and everyone will do it. But at the moment, we're just struggling to get traction for that thing. But the solution, I think, is the Green Deal is the solution. It's just we need to work out how to give it that traction.
I think governments, both central and local, understands, this is an important issue, that we actually do need to get, the energy that we spend in our homes, down to something, sensible. That's of national significance, just in terms of making sure that we've got enough energy to keep the lights on, essentially. But conversely, I think there's a behavioural issue here. Government have literally thrown money at this, and still not convinced people to do what they need to do to their homes, to make them, more insulated, better boilers, all that kind of stuff. And there's been stories about people not even wanting to have the roof loft insulation done because they've got to move stuff out of the loft first before somebody can go in and put the insulation in. So I think actually this might not be a problem for government. This actually might be a general issue of public awareness, that it is actually something that as a nation and as communities we actually do need to try to get people to do this. I think landlords will do it and are doing it from what I can see. Most of the problems will be with owner-occupiers, people who actually own their own homes and are not having this done because of the inconvenience of it. That's the kind of, as I see it at this particular minute in time. So I think there is an education issue yet again here, and there needs to be something put in place that actually, I guess, gets people to think this is something that we really do need to do, not just for ourselves but for the community at whole. And I don't know how quite you get to that particular situation.
Can I just put a bit of spin on it for you? Did Bristol use the Green Capital year to accelerate or increase what they were doing in terms of building energy consumption, building retrofit?
That's a really good question. There's a bit of chicken and egg in that, isn't there? So because there's been this interest in this agenda for so long in the city, and it's 3 attempts to win it, and that's happened across 3 different administrations politically in the city. So you've got a sense of longevity around this, some extraordinarily dedicated people at the City Council, and the fact that some of the activities it was already doing definitely contributed to the fact that we won the award. Yeah? All mean that there's been that, what you might call in business terms, that virtuous circle starting to happen in the city, yeah? Whereby people are politically recognising it, the community is recognising it, and so the thing just kind of scales up and up all the time. So, and I'm afraid I can't do justice to my colleagues at the City Council, but the City Council have an extraordinarily successful current retrofit operation going on their public housing scheme. It is literally fantastic. And obviously it's also launching its own energy company. There's lots of debate about the re-municipalisation, never say that word on a platform, of energy, but I think it's an interesting thing. So there is just a momentum of innovation, yeah, at city council level and at civil society level around this stuff, that has, been one of the contributing factors, I'm sure the contributing factor to winning the award.
Thank you. Just to add to that, one of my students who's in this room has just finished a piece of work looking at the relationship between the density of cities, or the density and energy consumption, and has found no correlation between density and energy consumption in buildings. There's a clear correlation on transport, but not on buildings. And the only conclusion we can reach at the moment, although we need lots more data, is that we think our urban cores are the worst performing So we don't have the resolution of data, but what that points at is it's the city centres that are furthest behind in terms of that retrofit challenge. It's the old stuff. Right, well, I think we've got time for one more question. Any more? I know roughly what you're going to ask, so and you've got lots of opportunities. So I will ask Mark, unless there's anybody else. Go on then.
Well, how do you know what I'm going to say, Matt?
You can always ask that later.
No. What I'm going to I'll avoid this. What I'm going to ask is, how have you on the panel found routes to break down the barriers between interest groups within this agenda who don't necessarily find cohesion comes naturally, shall we say?
Well, yes, because that's one of his great concerns. So we have a range of community of interest across the city or the city region, and one of the problems we're struggling with is how to get them to work cohesively in order to address this issue. So I mean that's I think. Well, do you want to start with?
I'm Mark Woodward, by the way.
Sorry,
Green Direction.
Was there a tipping point in Bristol? Was there a golden nugget or how have you managed to get?
I don't think there is a golden nugget or a silver. I don't think there is
a
a silver bullet to this. Okay, I mean, it goes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier. Is that everybody has a perspective that they think is the silver bullet to change this stuff, and I'm absolutely convinced it's only when all of those elements come together. Yeah. When energy understands that it's got a relationship to food, or that you really start to get the sophisticated models needed to make change happen. I seem to have made a career out of promoting the value of collaboration and partnership, and I'm firmly of the view that it's one of the most difficult things for human beings to do. Yeah, but it's also one of the most powerful tools for change that's out there. And so what the Green Capital Partnership simply does is create a space in the city that those conversations can happen in. Yeah? Does that mean we always solve it? Definitely not. Does it mean that week after week, almost day after day, we create situations for those conversations to occur? Yeah? And we do it once a month informally at something called the Green Mingle. It's a very simple, brilliant idea. Find a friendly bar. Everybody that cares about it in this sector, in this city, gets together and has a beer and chats about it. Unbelievably effective. Yeah? And then we do it much more structured around plans and workshops. And then we do it through an endless series of talks and debates. It never stops. Yeah? I mean, this year in Bristol, you could go to 3 things every day on this, quite literally. Yeah? And so you just constantly encourage collaboration. And you get enough people, that tipping point, that go, you know what, I actually didn't think it was going to be important with my food hat on to talk to my energy colleagues, but I just realised it was brilliant, and we've now done that, not that. Yeah? So it's the collective action thing. Very difficult, very important.
I actually think this is actually simpler than it probably looks, and that's quite simply that we've got to legitimise this sort of thinking, because I think there are too many barriers, still, to thinking that the green agenda has got to be an essential part of the collective agenda, for the city and the city policy making itself. And so I think I think what Bristol has done is it's actually got. I mean, I think you're probably been slightly, not sort of quite correct in maybe in saying that there isn't, an element of leadership there that has maybe it's not actually, been the sort of the implementer or the driver, but it has at least facilitated, the conversation. It has at least legitimised, the conversation. And I think it's legitimised it at a much higher and a much more centralised, kind of way, a much more focused way. And maybe that's what needs to happen here in Sheffield.
When I hear discussion about it's a complex process, we need to get people together and agree stuff and so on, my heart sinks. So we just haven't got the time, and it won't happen. And it'll just be a bunch of middle class engaged people who get involved, and the rest of the population won't touch at all. I despair sometimes that it is so difficult to make such little progress. We fully. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but I despair about how difficult it is and how difficult it is to bring about change. I think what part of the problem, to be frank about the sustainability movement, is it's become ideological. And essentially it's off the left. And I don't say I disagree with it, but actually what I do despair at is when people who put a contrary argument are put down as being evil. I think that just kills debate. And then other people then are worried about engaging in debate. And the way politics works is the more closely you agree with each other, the more you hate each other. And that's always been the case on the far left and on the far right, or whatever. And I think we need to depoliticise this, because it's actually something that's too important to squabble about for years, which is what we essentially do. And we need to find a way of actually having that debate so you don't get that whole sort of fruitless discourse all the time.
Right, thank you. Well, I think tonight we've heard some stimulating and vivid talks tonight. A few things have leapt out at me. We need a combined authority, or we'll be left behind. I think that's something for us to think about, how that works in practice, together with our leaders who are not advanced enough in their thinking. And David said, what you need is bright people, and I think that chimes with something that Bruce Katz said when he came over. Chase talent. Don't chase money, chase talent. The incumbent generation don't get it. I thought that was quite good. Go with the tram. I quite enjoyed that. And I think I think we need our own poo bus as a metaphor. We need to maybe find our own metaphor. So with that, if you'd like to thank our speakers and